We're going to focus this gubernatorial debate on education, specifically early childhood through 12th grade and some of the issues in Minnesota's education system. We want viewers to come away with a clear understanding of where these gentlemen stand in education and how they'll make some of their decisions. We have some really great questions from the studio audience and also from a special nonpartisan advisory panel representing a wide range of educational perspectives convened by the Minneapolis Foundation. I'm going to toss a few questions in along the way of my own, and we're going to start with brief remarks from all three of the candidates. About a minute each. Gentlemen, you'll get opening statements and then a closing statement, again about a minute each. In between, the goal is to have a lively debate, gentlemen. So I'm going to start with the DFL candidate for governor, Mark Dayton. Go ahead.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Minneapolis Foundation, and all of you for being here tonight. You know, my first job out of college, I taught a ninth grade general science in a New York City public school, and I've always said it was the toughest job I ever had. And I learned two things very quickly. First, it takes a lot of skill and dedication to become an effective teacher. And secondly, I had a class of 32 children, 4 different languages. Many of them couldn't read or write beyond the second or third grade level. And I found that I could not reach individually 32 kids in a classroom. So when I go to Rochester, Minnesota, and I see 35 children in a 5th grade classroom with 1 teacher, and I see those kind of overcrowded conditions all over the state, and I see school districts going to 4-day school weeks, and 90% of our school districts in Minnesota having to go to the property taxpayers for operating referenda, I know that we're going in the wrong direction and we're underfunding public education, because the challenges that teachers face around the state today are even more challenging than the ones I faced in New York City in schools that have 10, 20, sometimes 60, 70 different languages and dialects. So the challenges are enormous, the needs are great.
All right, thank you. GOP candidate for governor, Tom Emmer, your turn.
I, too, would like to thank the Minneapolis Foundation and all of you for showing up today, and everybody who's watching, and Kathy, you for doing this, and my 2 colleagues for being here as well. I have been traveling this state for 15 months talking about how we have to bring our government, our state government, into the 21st century. We need to redesign it from the bottom up so that it delivers services people expect in an efficient, affordable, sustainable manner. It will be smaller if it's going to be more efficient. And at the same time, we've been talking about creating a business environment that will drive jobs, new jobs in the state of Minnesota. You can redesign government all you want to be the most efficient delivery system of services, and you can create the best business environment in the world. And if we don't have the next generation ready to drive the economic engine, it's all for naught. So the issues that we're going to talk about here today when it comes to K-12 education and pre-K are very important to the future of this state. And I think you'll find an interesting difference of opinion. I don't believe it is all about just throwing more money. Government has to live within the resources it has. It's about looking at how those resources are being utilized and empowering our great administrators and our teachers, our professionals, to put those resources where they believe they can be most effective.
All right, thank you. Independence Party candidate Tom Horner.
Thank you. And let me echo my appreciation for the hosts and for all of you being here. I agree with my 2 colleagues. I do think, like everybody in this room, and I think everybody in Minnesota, that education is an essential part of who we are. It is the element that defines Minnesota in so many ways. But we have to go beyond the rhetoric. We have to go beyond the language. We really need to say that if we want to make Minnesota the knowledge state, if we really want to maintain our talent pool as our distinctive, competitive economic advantage, then we better be prepared to make the tough decisions. We truly have to start looking at education as a seamless system, from early childhood all the way through lifelong learning. We can't say that we will abandon children and hope that they somehow on their own get ready for kindergarten, any more than we can turn to that 50-year-old who has done everything that we have asked of that person and yet had the rug pulled out from under by the economy. We need to prepare everyone with the kinds of skills that they will need to be not just productive workers, but good citizens. Because part of the fabric of Minnesota is our civic engagement. Part of the fabric of Minnesota is how we come together as citizens. That's really what we talk about when we're talking about education, how to prepare people to live successful lives.
Okay.
And I think that's what education needs to accomplish. That's why I'm happy to have the conversation.
Thanks. This is a debate about education. Let's start with this question. It comes from the audience. I'll actually start with Tom Horner. Who or what most strongly influences your thinking on education policy matters?
Oh, I've had great opportunities to have conversations with a variety of people who I think are great leaders on education. People like Kurt Johnson and Ted Coldry and Todd Otis, people who have been very invested in early childhood education, in reforming education, in thinking about how we deliver education directly. But I've also had the opportunity to sit down with some of our great superintendents, teachers, school board members, those people who are on the front lines of actually delivering education. And so it's all of those people, along with, we need to keep in mind that oftentimes the forgotten part of this equation are the students. And so I've also sat down and talked with a lot of the students about what they need out of education. And so all of those folks have influenced me.
Senator Dayton, same question.
Well, I will, whenever I'm asked who are my heroes, I mentioned Betty Jo Ogren, who was my teacher in both 3rd and 4th grade, and took a new boy in a school struggling and literally saved my life. And so that's my role model for an effective teacher. I visited it in the last decade as a United States Senator, and thereafter I've been in a couple hundred schools in Minnesota, a couple thousand classrooms. So I've had great instructors, those who are actually involved in teaching. I've had 110 community meetings, so school board members, superintendents, who've talked to me about the disastrous situations they're facing with the underfunding of their schools, the cutbacks, the layoffs, the overcrowded classrooms. So I had a whole spectrum of Minnesotans, the educators, the people who really deliver educational services every day and under extremely adverse conditions, and they're the best, and the students. And I visited left one elementary school, and I turned to my staff and said, if we could just lower the voting age to 5, I might win another election. And she smiled and said, it would be close.
Representative Emmer.
Well, I think it is. I listen to parents. I actually interact with students, so I get to see them on a regular basis through my community activities. And then there's another group that I listen to. It's not just the teachers and the administrators who are at the ground level delivering the service. I listen to the people in the business community who are talking about what their needs are for the future. Are we going to be producing, we getting the performance, we getting the results out of our K-12 education system that we expect? And then lastly, or I guess it would be even before business, it would be our higher ed folks, because the cost of remedial education is a big issue. When we're not producing what we need to out of our K-12 system, and we have to invest all the more resources to try and get them up to speed, to get the experience we expect them to have in the higher education system, that's what I'm listening to.
And when we talk about education, gentlemen, there's one subject that concerns educators and lawmakers and parents. It's the wide gap in student achievement between white students and students of color. And Minnesota, as you know, has one of the largest and most persistent achievement gaps in the nation. Now, this question comes from the Minnesota Minority Education Partnership. Given that it's not unusual to have students of color being measured at rates of up to 50% lower than their white peers on achievement measures, will your administration set aggressive goals that are clear and measurable to reduce and eliminate these disparities? Tom Emmer, I'm going to start with you first.
Absolutely. This is probably one of the greatest tragedies in Minnesota right now. For Minnesota to have this big of an achievement gap based on race is inexcusable in this state. And I was looking in preparation for this. It's almost $700 million we can talk about for the next biennium that's supposed to be going to close the achievement gap. We need to focus more attention on the pre-K years. We need to make sure those programs have approved curricula that prepare these kids. Literacy should be the goal, so that when they get into the K-12 system, they have an opportunity to succeed. And then we've talked about some very aggressive things, creating empowerment zones, which would allow, for instance, the Minneapolis and the St. Paul school districts to opt out of certain mandates that might be tying their hands from allocating resources in a manner that they think would be more acceptable. We should also be grading schools on the outcomes. It's based on performance. We should demand excellence, and we should never assume any child wants to achieve anything less but the best they can be, and we need to give them the opportunity to do that.
Tom Porter, would you agree with what Representative Emmer just said?
Well, in part, but I think this also is an area where action has to match the rhetoric, and the fact is, in 2009, Representative Emmer, you were one of, I think, 7 legislators to vote against significant funding for early childhood education. And so I think we have to be consistent, and you have your principles, and I think you have to stick with them, and they're not the same principles that I have, because I do believe that we ought to invest in early childhood education. I think that is how we're going to close the achievement gap. And so I've put money, new money, into my budget to fund early childhood learning, to make sure that we have the resources.
About $120 million, is that
right? But I think we have to go beyond that and really look at how we restructure schools. You know, one of the good things, and there's a lot to criticize about No Child Left Behind, but one of the positives is that it has highlighted the achievement gap. I don't think we'd be having this conversation in quite the same detail if it weren't for the data produced by No Child Left Behind. Now, I think we have to work with NCLB, eliminate some of the rigidity, allow teachers to teach, make sure we have good principals in schools, but we have to also make sure that we're working with the communities, that we're making sure that we're dealing with issues not just in the schools, but that we're dealing with issues like health care, that children are coming to school healthy and prepared to learn. It's all of those issues.
Senator Dayton, go ahead, jump right in.
Well, I'd start with yes. The answer to the question is absolutely yes. And we need the strategies beginning with early childhood education. We lag behind most other states in the percentage of our children who have opportunities to take part in early childhood education. We have less than half of the children in Minnesota compared to the national average in all-day kindergarten. And one of my proposals is to provide state funding for optional all-day kindergarten.
That's expensive. That's a lot of money.
Some people say we can't afford to do it. I say we can't afford not to do it. Because we're talking here about having children from the very early age, before this achievement gap develops, have developed the skills and have the opportunities that are absolutely necessary. So then when they do start first grade, that gap has been narrowed. And then we follow the example of schools such as in Lakeville, St. Croix, where they do a 1-minute reading out loud diagnostic test in the first week of 2nd, 3rd, 4th grade, determine which children are reading below grade level. If there's funding available, and it needs to be, for either individual or small group remedial assistance, they say that children that stay with that school the entire year, 85% are reading above grade level by the end of the year. That's life transforming. Those are the kind of strategies we need to develop from the very beginning, carry all the way through to close this achievement gap.
Would you have clear, concise, measurable goals to close this gap?
Yes, based on the progress of individual students. But now, you know, we administer, I'm told, 61 tests between 3rd grade and 11th grade, state and federal mandates. Most of the results are not available to the schools till after the school year. So, you know, there are some tests that are valuable to determine accountability and to determine these measures, as Mr. Horner said, of student achievement. But the real focus ought to be on testing that improves individual children's progress in academics and in their social development.
Tom Emmer, would you agree with that?
Well, I'm not sure what he just said. You're talking about you're going to have measurements, but I don't understand what the measurements are. You've got to set a baseline, and I know there's some disagreement within the education community about testing, but right now that's the best thing we have. We need to have testing that is designed to set a baseline, and then we need to be able to do testing after the year is over or after the course is over to determine whether or not we've accomplished the outcome that we expected. It's about being competent in whatever subject area we're talking about. And I think that is a measurement that must be put in place in order to know that we're getting value for the dollars that we're putting in order to know that we have effective teachers in the classroom. And we need to make sure that we have a system that rewards that as well.
You brought up effective teachers, and let me throw this out here. Not enough is said about the parents in some of these equations here. You're only as strong as your weakest link, and a lot of these kids need support at home. Really, what's state government role in trying to get parents into this equation too, Tom Horner?
Well, the other day I was out at Fair Oaks Elementary in the Osseo School District, a terrific program that starts engaging kids using some early learning dollars, so leveraging those dollars, at 3 years old. Now, these are kids that are coming largely from low-income families. And this is a program that takes these kids, involves them in early learning, makes them ready for kindergarten, and then tracks them up to 3rd grade. So the first response I want to make is that we can measure, and we ought to measure, not with the heavy load of testing that we have, but at critical junctures. We need to know that children are reading at grade level by 3rd grade. That's critical. So we ought to measure that, and we ought to make sure that they get there. But the other neat part about this program is that it also is geared to bring the parents into the school, to get them involved. And what we see time and again, what all the evidence shows is that when you have schools with site-based control, when you allow teachers to teach, when you give them some autonomy, and when you create innovative programs that deals with kids and moves them along, you get the parents involved. So Fair Oaks is one of many schools that does bring the parents in, gets them involved. Not only gets them involved, but says, here's what we're working on with your child, and then says, here's a package of materials that you can take home and work with your kids. They're having tremendous success. That's the way we ought to go.
We brought up early childhood, and this is a focus, obviously, of the Minneapolis Foundation and others who are concerned about education. And of course, many experts look to quality preschool programs as a way to get the littlest learners ready for school. Then, of course, as they go on in school, they're better prepared and they get good jobs and all of that. Representative Emmer, as you know, about 1% of the state's budget goes right now to early childhood education programs. And if I'm not mistaken, you suggest a reallocation of current monies for early childhood. How much are you talking about here?
Well, I'm not. I think that would be disrespectful to the process. I absolutely do believe, contrary to what some might suggest, that it's not about throwing more money. It's about putting the money we have where the professionals believe it needs to go.
Reallocation of money.
Right, but you're asking me now how much. I mean, that's going to be determined when you get to the legislative process. We put a number on what we believe the state has to spend in K-12 next year in the education sector. We're talking about, I think it was $13.8 billion. I've just told you we spent about $700 million right now, arguably in this biennium, to attack the achievement gap, and we're not getting anywhere with it. So when you talk about reallocating dollars, there are plenty of dollars right now that have been used to address the problem of the achievement gap. Perhaps they can be better utilized elsewhere, but you got to talk about the people that are in this room, I suspect, some of the professional educators who will participate in that process. I think about early childhood learning, and the question earlier that you asked, Kathy, that came from the audience was, what's the state's involvement in getting parents involved? And as I was listening to the answer, it just suddenly occurred to me that, you know, one of the problems we have is we create situations, I believe, where parents feel that their child has been put in a situation where they're not going to succeed. I think every parent, and there are probably a lot of folks in this room that have come from backgrounds that are challenging environments where they have achieved. They have managed to pull themselves up because they took advantage of the opportunities that presented themselves and they made it through. We should do the same thing with early childhood. We need to empower parents to give their child the opportunity to be successful. And I believe there's a great example. I used it recently of the New Horizon Academy.
Briefly.
New Horizon Academy opened up an academy on Rice Street in partnership with some businesses. They tell me that it takes 3 years typically to fill up one of their academies. On Rice Street, it took 6 months and they had a waiting list. And I believe that's because parents, when given the opportunity to put their child in a position to have a better life, to get a better outcome, they're going to take it and they're going to get involved. So it's trying to give them the incentive to become involved.
Senator, how much money do you want to spend on early childhood
programs? Well, I'm not going to put a price tag on it, Kathy, because I will go to the experts, and I've met with some of them.
But by and large, you must have some idea.
You know, I don't, because I have to ask them what's necessary. I think we, as I said earlier, can't afford to do what's necessary. I agree with Representative Emmer. We want to make sure the dollars are most effectively spent. This is a perfect place for a public-private partnership because there are many organizations, the Minnesota Business Partnership and collaboration from Republican leader of the Senate, Dwayne Benson's involved there, to his credit and to their credit, the McKnight Foundation, others are here, Minneapolis Foundation. And you know, there's so much going on now that's necessary, and I would bring that group together if I'm elected in November and say, you know, you help set a budget. You tell us and tell the people of Minnesota what we need to do, because this is an investment in the future of our state for the next 70, 80, 90 years, the lifetimes of these young people who will become our citizens and our entrepreneurs and our successful contributors to a better society. So that, to me, is a perfect environment for a collaborative effort between the private, nonprofit, and public sectors. We're
going to talk about K-12 and early childhood funding here later on in the debate. But actually, Tom Horner opened the door a little bit to something that I want to kind of explore with Mr. Emmer. You are supportive of early childhood education programs, right?
Yes.
So why did you vote against? You voted against the Omnibus Education Funding Bill in 2009, which included money for early childhood, and just this past spring in May, you voted against the Omnibus Early Childhood Bill. Yeah. So if you're supportive, you're saying one thing, but you're doing something else.
Well, that's not necessarily true, Kathy. If you want to take something with a snapshot, then go ahead. I mean, if we're talking about an omnibus bill, which, by the way, includes a lot more than what you're talking about.
But the Omnibus Early Childhood Bill,
here's the other piece.
Something different.
It's about living within your means. If you think that government is just going to be growing every biennium by double-digit percentages we're not going to be able to sustain this type of growth. And why would you vote against something like that? Because government's got to start to set its priorities and live within its means and fund those priorities. Those bills that you're talking about, not only did they include what I would consider extraneous issues, which certainly could be subject to negotiation, but they assumed the government needs to grow beyond its revenues, and that's simply not acceptable any longer. We can't keep spending what we want to spend. We got to spend what we have to spend, and more importantly, we have to start allocating the existing resources more appropriately.
Well, let me just say that a 6-year record isn't a snapshot, it's a motion picture. And when that 6-year record is consistent, it's a very clear, in color, technicolor motion picture. And the fact is, in 2009, it was a very specific amendment, and you were one of 7 representatives to vote against, not an omnibus bill, but money for early childhood learning. So again, I respect your principles, but I think you have to be consistent with them, and I think you have to be honest with audiences, and I think you have to say the same thing to every audience, not just tailor messages to different audiences. And my position is very clear. I think early childhood learning should be a priority. I think it should be a priority, and I've put money in my proposed budget to make it a priority, because I think it is where we start. I think when you have 50% of Minnesota children coming into kindergarten not fully prepared for success, it is no wonder that we are struggling with sinking graduation rates from high school, and we can't afford to do that. We will pay for that cost. We can pay for it now with smart investments, with good programs, or we can pay for it later in much higher social service costs.
Do you want a quick rebuttal here, Mr. Emmer?
Well, I just point out first, I would appreciate it if we wouldn't challenge someone's integrity. I have been very consistent from day one. Since I got in the legislature as a guy who actually hasn't been a professional public relations guy grown up in government, or as somebody who's been running for public office since 1982, I've been very consistent. People in government and people that are making their living off of government need to understand that in order for us to pay for what we expect for out of government, we've got to grow jobs in the private sector. You can't keep talking as politicians do about, we know how to invest your money better. And you know what? When I vote against something like that, yeah, it's tough, because I'm the only one sitting up here right now that's got 7 kids, and I've got 5 of them in school still, all right? This is a big deal to somebody like me, Tom, and I'll tell you, when I vote against something like that, it's difficult, but you've got to look at the big picture. You can't do what everybody in government has been doing for years, which is, well, you know, it's just going to have to grow. You've got to be responsible, and the message we're sending is that government's got to live within your means. The consistent message that you, my colleagues, are sending is we just got to tax people more and allow government to grow unrestrained, and that simply is not sustainable, nor is it responsible.
Let me ask you something, Senator Dayton. I was thinking about this as I was preparing for this debate. Your DFL primary opponent, House Speaker Margaret Anderson Kelleher, brought this up. She suggested funding early childhood programs through a constitutional amendment. She felt it was that important to do that. Would you consider such a long-term funding mechanism for early childhood?
Well, if it's necessary, I would consider that. I'm not sure what that would achieve because, you know, frankly, the Supreme Court of Minnesota ruled 40 years ago that it was unconstitutional to fund the public schools exactly the way we're doing it now, which was reliance on the property tax. They said that was inherently unequal. And that's why they created was what then called the Minnesota Miracle, which was a progressive income tax and a progressive source of state revenues that funded most of public K-12 education. Now we would say early childhood and kindergarten as well. So, you know, that should be the priority, is actually carrying out what the mandate has already been from the Supreme Court, and what we know is fair and equitable in Minnesota. So when you've had, in real after inflation dollars, the state support for per pupil aid cut by $1,300 under Governor Plenty's 2 terms, you know directly. First of all, you got overcrowded classrooms, more 4-day school weeks, and you have the unfairness that if one does, you know, school district, the referendum is approved, the children are spared further pain, and if it's disapproved somewhere else, the children suffer. There's more layoffs among teachers and the like. So, I mean, let's work within the framework we have. We know what's necessary. We know we need to make a commitment. We should know that we had 10 years ago, we were above the state national average in per pupil K-12 funding, and now we're below the national average. We should know that our average teacher salary is $2,300 below the national average. You know, we can talk about reform as we should. $2,300. Thank you. We should know that you know, these are commitments that Minnesota has made in the past because education is our value and our priority, and we're not reflecting that in our budget today.
I'd like to do just a quick little round of yes-no questions, and I'm going to leave early childhood with this question. Do you favor, yes or no, the creation of a Department of Early Childhood Education?
You know,
Yes or no?
We'll see.
We'll see. Okay.
No, I don't give yes or no answers to complex problems.
The creation
Tom
of a
Harkin, my colleague, said for every complex problem, there's a simple answer, and it's almost always wrong.
Okay. Yes or no, Representative Emmer, do you favor the creation of a Department of Early Childhood Education?
No.
Okay.
No, we have the structure to do what we need to do. We need the leadership and political will to do it.
Coming back down this way then, Tom Horner, yes or no, do you support compulsory attendance until age 18?
Yes.
Tom Emmer?
If the legislature passed it, I wouldn't oppose it, but I think you got to make school valuable so kids want to be there rather than telling them this is your sentence till you're 18. They should want to show up because they're getting something of value.
So that's a yes?
I think I did what Senator Dayton did.
Okay.
I agree with Representative Emmer. Let's give them the reasons to stay in school.
Okay, so you would go with that. All right, I'm going to move on to another yes/no question. Do you support lengthening the school year?
I think we need a longer school year, yes. I think our kids need to spend more time in school, which is why I disagree with the 4-day school weeks.
Okay. Representative Emmer?
I think we leave that up to our school boards.
Okay. Tom Horner?
I think we need more time in the classrooms, and we can do that and still balance it against other needs, including tourism.
Okay. Senator Dayton, this is an in-studio audience question here. Thank you very much. Really good questions. This is about K-12 funding. What is your plan to provide sustainable funding for education in Minnesota, funding that will provide consistency and continuity for budgeting and planning purposes?
Raise revenues progressively and have the state be the principal source, ideally the primary source of funding for K-12 education, which is what the Minnesota Supreme Court ruled was constitutionally required 4 years ago, which we know is necessary because the property tax is the most regressive and unfair tax we have. Middle-income taxpayers pay 5 times more as a percent of their income in property taxes as the highest income earners of the state. They pay 2.5 times more as a percent of their income in sales taxes as the highest income earners, which is why a basic difference is my two opponents here are going to raise sales tax or property tax on middle income taxpayers, and I want the people who are best off in this state to pay so that we can protect middle income taxpayers from this burden.
Now, your budget has a problem. You're about $1 billion short.
$890 million, actually.
Okay, $890 million.
And because I'm holding on to not repaying, repaying the shift. I mean, we penalize our school districts, including those that have been most fiscally responsible, as the legislature and the governor have over the last years with the shift, which is really a misnomer. You know, I say if I reached my hand and I wouldn't do this into your pocket and take out your wallet and say I'll give it back to you when I feel like it, we don't. In the real world, we don't call that a shift. You know, so they've used it as a piggy bank or as something else and taken, this money and say, well, we'll repay it. Now it's in law that it's supposed to be repaid in the next biennium. So I'd like to follow the law, and I'd like to square the books. I think the state needs to get its fiscal house in order so local governments can operate responsibly as they have been and not be penalized for doing so.
So you'd like to do that,
but
can you tell us now, are you going to pay back the shift on time or delay?
Well, as I say, I've got an $890 million gap. If in the worst case scenario, if I can't find a way through that with the kind of reforms I'd bring in place, so if I'm elected between now and the issuing a budget and end of next January, February, that's the fallback position. But I'm not willing to go with that now, and even that would be then a partial repayment, because I think that's wrong. We owe the schools that money. The law says it needs to be repaid, and I think we should honor the law and the principle that the state will get its financial house in order, and so local governments, cities and counties and townships and school districts can know that they can depend on the state's financial commitments.
Representative Emmer, I saw your new ad on education.
You looked almost like a Democrat there, Tom.
You're talking about holding education harmless, that your budget plan holds flat education spending, which sounds good, but you don't factor in inflation in your plan. And I'm curious, how does your plan then protect classroom funding?
Well, it absolutely, when you talk about holding it flat, again, it's within existing revenues, and we're adding about $500 million of the federal money to it. Before we go to that, though, Kathy, because your question was, how are we going to sustain funding in the future?
Correct.
First off, Senator, I think you're a little bit more than $800 and some billion short with your new education plan that you put out with all the great investments that don't have numbers on it. It looks like it may go well beyond $1 billion short if you do the things that you're talking about, but I understand those don't have numbers. You also talked earlier about we need to work within the existing framework. We should work within the existing framework. And with all due respect, if 100 years ago people sitting up here would have said we had to work within the existing framework, we might still be in one-room schoolhouses. You can't say that what we're doing today is working, because I've only been in the legislature 6 years, and this has been one of the hottest topics every single year. How are we going to do this? You have to start thinking outside the box. You have to start empowering the education professionals that are actually at the administrative level and in the classroom. You have to let them start having input as to how the resources need to be determined, not just the head of the education union. That's one of the biggest problems that nobody's talking about, and that's what we have to go after, is empowering people at the local level, in the classroom, in the schools, to make sure that the money's going where it needs to go.
Senator, actually, the representative brought up something. I mean, looking at your new education plan that was released, you don't have dollar figures on all-day kindergarten and some of the things you really want to do, and those are expensive propositions. Really, how do you pay for all that?
Well, those are the priorities that I've set in my administration. And as resources become available, as we work our way, hopefully, as a nation and as a state, out of this economic serious recession, and as the funds become available, those are my commitments and my priorities. I don't have the dollars in my budget today. I'm going to look every possible way, if I'm elected, with those who I can bring into state government. You know, we're inheriting a 20-year legacy of really an indifference to the quality functioning of state government. And I believe there are a lot of savings that are possible there once we get in there and send commissioners in there who believe in the purpose and the mission of the agencies. And that's my commitment. Okay. We'll find more resources, and as they become available, through job creation and through efficiencies in our operating side,
you'll get to where
I'll put that money into education first and foremost.
Tom Horner, you're going to delay the repayment, is that right? $1.7 billion?
Yes, I am, unfortunately. You know, I do have to say, though, it's always fun listening to my colleagues talk back and forth. I don't understand most of what they're saying or where their positions are, but it's always fun listening to them. Fact is, we do have to lay out a very clear position on education, and I've done that. I was at the Humphrey Institute on Monday and articulated a very clear set of principles, a very clear vision for education, and I am willing to put the money against it, and I'm more importantly willing to put the leadership to it. And so, yes, I went to the superintendents and school boards, and I said, I'd love to pay back the shifts and the accounting, the deferrals and the accounting shifts. And the reality is the money's not there. There's 20% of the operating budget that we are in deficit. And with all due respect to Representative Emmer, it is real money, and it is a real shortfall. And we can't pay it back without doing serious harm either to the economy through higher tax increases that we can't afford, particularly when they're directed at the wrong place, or can we afford to say we'll just cut deeper? We can't afford to do that. We need an education system that works for all Minnesotans. We need to invest in early learning. We need to allow teachers to teach. We need to have good principals. We do need to bring Education Minnesota to the table as partners to deal with seniority, tenure, with those critical issues. But then, look, we haven't even started to talk about higher education, which is another critical area that we need to invest in.
And that's a debate for another time.
Right, I understand.
But Tom Horner just said, this is real money we're talking about. Are you just unwilling to say to folks, really, I'm going to cut education?
Yeah, no, we're not. Our commitment is going to increase to K-12 education. But what I'd say to both of my colleagues up here and everybody else is we have to start recognizing that you can't just keep going the pace we're going, because we'll be back here in 2 years or 4 years, we'll be talking about it again. Both of my colleagues talk about raising taxes, $2.15 billion plus, 2 to 3 to 5. I don't know where you're at right now in terms of raising taxes, but that's your thought. You talk about progressive. I tell you what, the only progress that we'll see is more business leaving this state. And if you want to pay for education, if you want to do the investments that some politicians like to call them with the public's money, you got to be growing your private economy. You want to have a long-term sustainable funding source for K-12, for early ed, for your higher education institutions. You got to be growing jobs in your private economy, because that ultimately is what pays for all of these things that we expect from government.
Senator Dayton.
Well, it grows jobs in our private economy more than anything else is the best quality education system in the world. And that's what we cannot afford to sacrifice. Now, Representative Emmer, your budget calls for the same level of funding for the next 2 years for K-12 education as this 2 years, $13.3 billion of state money and $500 million of federal stimulus. So you put in $13.8 billion. The formula in existing law for per pupil aid would drive that to $14.3 billion. So you're $500 million short. And what you're overlooking is that the projection is there'll be 10,500 more students in our public schools next year than there were this year in 2012 compared to 2010. And they estimate now over 20,000 more in total the year after that. So if you're going to keep the same level of funding and we're going to have 20,000 more school children in our public schools by the end of the biennium, once again, you're going to have less money per pupil. You're going to have overcrowded classrooms. You want to go to the educators and ask them what's necessary to be successful. Go ask teachers, how do you be an effective teacher in a classroom with 35 children? You can't be effective in that situation. We've got to get class sizes down. We've got to provide all-day kindergarten, and these things are just essential so that educators can succeed.
Tom Horner.
Both of these start from the wrong premise. I mean, both gentlemen start with the premise of how much. And Representative Emmer would say a lot less, and Senator Dayton would say a lot more. We need to start asking the question of what for? What do we need to achieve as outcomes? What's important to the state of Minnesota? And there are two outcomes that are absolutely critical to economic success, to civic success, to our success as a state. And the first is we need more Minnesotans who have had some level of post-high school education, including degree programs. And we need to make sure, secondly, that Minnesotans have access to lifelong learning. And when you start with those two outcomes and back up, you need to be spending better on K-12 education. You need to be thinking of it as E-12 education. You need to be investing in early learning. You need to reform the structure of school, not just by changing the funding, but by saying we need to allow teachers to teach. We need to give them more autonomy, more authority, and more accountability. We need schools with great principals, and we need superintendents that have the flexibility and the ability to say, this is really a terrific, young, innovative teacher. We need to keep her in our system, regardless of seniority rules.
I'm glad you brought up teachers. This question comes from the advisory panel. Is the current 10-year policy for teachers satisfactory, or should it be changed?
Oh, it absolutely ought to be changed. I mean, look at in Anoka-Hennepin, the largest school district in the state, Centennial High School. Terrific program for vocal music, a career path for kids who wanted to be in vocal music, kind of the glee of Centennial High School. And students loved it, parents loved it. Great teacher was going to be lost. The superintendent went to Education Minnesota and said, allow me to exempt 1% of the teaching slots. Now, this is a district with 2,800 teachers. He's asking for 28 slots. Education Minnesota turned him down. The program's lost. Now he's going to lose another program that also tied to an innovative teacher. You can't afford to do that. We do need some flexibility. We need to work with Education Minnesota, but we do need to have some flexibility so that we can keep the best teachers in the school.
Representative Emmer, how would you work with Education Minnesota to change the tenure system?
Nowhere else in our state are you evaluated, or do you get to keep your job just because you've been there the longest? I mean, you keep your job because you're providing something of value and you're performing, all right? Teaching should be no different. We've got great teachers in this state. What we would propose, rather than just eliminate tenure outright, is have a 5-year renewal process where every 5 years you go through a review of the teacher, where they're at. You have measurements, because it's not just about measuring students' progress, about measuring the effectiveness of our teachers. Have a 5-year review on tenure. Give the school districts more flexibility, and I think you'll see better results.
Senator Dayton, you are endorsed by Education Minnesota. I know this is a subject that is kind of touchy with that particular group at times. What would you do with the group? Would you work with Education Minnesota to try to change the tenure system?
Well, I think any private sector employer or a public sector employer who comes into a situation where there's established union works with the union. You know, and tenure is a seniority system. That's a basic principle of unions in the public and private sectors. If somebody's going to go in and try to destroy that as it affects 60 or 70,000 people, I think they're going to, create a very destructive relationship that's going to just overshadow everything else. We need to get rid of bad teachers. We need to get rid of bad principals. I learned when I was teaching in a dysfunctional school in New York City, a bad teacher ruins a classroom, a bad principal ruins a school. We need a way that those individuals who are not performing and have been evaluated and are found wanting or are just burned out and don't want to be in the profession, we need a way to get them out of the system. And I will support doing that. When I came in as state auditor, right away I was confronted with 2 employees that was proven to embezzled public funds, and I fired them. And one was reinstated, and I took that all the way to the Minnesota Supreme Court. So I will take this principle that everybody in the sector who is paid for by taxpayers' dollars needs to be doing her or his job and doing it well. And if they're not, if there are conditions that call for that person's removal, if those are not available now, then I will work with the entities or even with their disapproval to achieve that.
All right.
But I think to go in there with a blade saw, where you need to be using a scalpel, is just going to really be destructive to the whole process. And once again, I just point out, it's easy to sweep all these things under the rug. The big bad wolf, Education Minnesota. Teachers are professionals. Most of them highly trained, highly skilled, very dedicated. And through a small d democratic process, they have elected people to represent them. Now that's a basic, inherent, I believe, American right. Certainly right in Minnesota, to organize and be represented in collective bargaining. And I think anybody who comes into a management position, whether it's in business or in the public sector, who doesn't respect that is really, as I say, just going to make it more destructive and not successful.
I heard someone try to say something over here.
Let's hope that a criminal offense is not the line in the sand before we remove a bad employee. I mean, there are good teachers, a lot of good teachers, but we also have ineffective teachers. What we ought to be doing is something along the lines of the Wayzata School District, a terrific program in which the union, teachers, the school administration work together to take Q-Comp money, not just to reward teachers, but as staff development, to help make ineffective teachers better, to help train them and make them better teachers, not just the young teachers, but the experienced teachers. It's those kinds of things that we need to be investing in. So I agree with you. We ought to be working with the union, but we also work with the union on a level playing field, on equal terms. And when the union says that there are these kinds of stakes in the ground that are at the disadvantage of students, that are losing great programs that can't be replicated, then I think we as leaders have an obligation to students, to parents, and to other teachers to say, we will do what is best for the students. And that ought to be not just our first priority, but our only priority.
Tom, Emmer efforts, as you know, to pass an alternative teacher licensure bill didn't go anywhere last session. What would you work toward that as governor?
Absolutely, and I mean, it gets to this, we want to work with a union. You're absolutely right. We want to work with the teachers. That's who we want to work with. We want to work with the professional educators, the administrators of our schools. It has become abundantly clear to somebody who was working, at least trying to understand both sides of the aisle in St. Paul, which, by the way, there was much agreement on alternative teacher licensure on both sides of the aisle. It's necessary, not because we've got so many teachers out of work right now, but we do have a shortage when it comes to people that can help in science and math that's on the horizon. World languages. These are things where we should create an alternative teacher licensure program where we can get the talent that we already have in this state into the classroom and benefit off it. But it was almost a tragedy to watch last legislative session, as it wasn't the teachers and it was not the administrators, it was the head of Education Minnesota that literally said, we're not going to do this, and it didn't go anywhere. And that's inexcusable. That has to be talked about openly and honestly. We might have a difference of opinion, but you can't stand in the way of reform.
And he's not right here to defend himself, obviously. But I want to ask Senator Dayton something, because you do bring it up when we've done interviews, and you just early on in this conversation, you talk about teaching in New York City when you were a young man. And you were part of a program that's kind of a precursor to today's Teach for America. And teachers' unions are not terribly fond of Teach for America. But you taught in the classroom in that manner. And I'm wondering, why shouldn't other qualified non-traditional teachers be allowed to do the same thing with alternative teacher licensure?
Well, that's not exactly correct, Kathy. I met the requirements back then of the New York City Board of Education, which you had to have a bachelor's degree and it had to be qualified in the subject you were going to teach. I was teaching ninth grade general science. I was pre-med. I took advanced physics and inorganic and organic chemistry and biology in college, and you had to have 12 teaching credits in an accredited teaching institution, which was arranged that summer with the University of Massachusetts, and it was an intensive summer program, taught summer school, and so that met the qualifications. You say they should have been higher in this day and age, they might have been, but this was way back in 1969. And I was accredited. I mean, some of this other stuff, there's a book written, it's about that thick, about the New York City Board of Education. If you want to go to sleep some night, I'll give it to you, I'll loan it to you to read. But the labyrinth there was such that, you got one temporary license to get started, and then, after the bureaucracy caught up, I'm amazed they've delivered the license today, given how dysfunctional they are. Then I had a regular license. I was a regular teacher of ninth grade general science. I mean, this is, some of the people that are bringing this up, like the Republican Party, this is a point of absolute absurdity.
Okay.
And it was a lesson, though, let me also say, that because it relates to this issue. I mean, I knew ninth grade general science forward and backward and upside down. That didn't automatically make me a good teacher. I had to learn how to teach. I had to learn the skills of relating to students, of being an effective teacher, motivating students. So, I mean, are there skills that people in the private sector have that could be valuable in education? Absolutely. And we have existing law in the books so that if a school district wants to bring somebody like that in, they can do so. Unfortunately, the State Department of Education, a couple of years ago, I know for a fact, an elementary school in St. Paul had a couple of very well-qualified Hmong teaching assistants, spoke the language that 90% of their students taught. They have made the St. Paul School District made a request for a waiver to the State Department of Education and turned it down. My State Department of Education will grant those waivers, so we can bring people that also are committed and prepared for teaching who bring some special set of skills.
We have about 3 minutes left before closing statements. Tom Horner, what skills and attributes are you looking for in an education commissioner?
Oh, I think you need somebody who has a vision, who has a clear set of principles, but who also brings a commitment to education as a fundamental cornerstone of Minnesota's economy, of Minnesota's life. And so I'm looking for somebody who comes with a background in a related field, somebody who can has relationships with different constituencies with education. And I think among one of the most important attributes is somebody who is a person who can engage the public, who can speak to teachers, to the public, to parents, to all audiences, and really get them involved in making education a priority for the whole state.
Tom Emmer, what are you looking for an education commissioner?
Somebody who's prepared to help us enact our agenda. Somebody who's ready to help us empower not only local administrators and educators to do what they see best, if they see a need to opt out of different state mandates in order to make decisions that they believe will best position the kids to succeed in their classrooms, we need to do that. Somebody who will empower parents to be able to make choices based on whether or not the school or the education environment that their child is in is the best environment for that child to learn. Somebody who is committed to helping us enact the agenda that we're talking about.
And Senator Dayton?
Someone who has the proven commitment through a professional career in education, proven success in whatever aspect of that, a proven leader, someone who can work well with people, who can bring the different stakeholders together. And I would agree with Mr. Horner, who says that the number one priority, number one consideration should always be what's in the best interest of our students, the 825,000 that we're educating in our public schools today. How can we improve that? What do we need to do to accomplish that? What are the resources we need to accomplish that?
Since the camera's on you, let's go to closing statements. Each of you gets a minute, starting with Senator Dayton. Go ahead.
Well, we're in an era now, as I say, of limited resources. We recognize that. My priority will be education. I set forth a program yesterday that protects middle-income taxpayers and recognizes that the resources necessary are going to have to come if we're going to meet this commitment. We have more kids, 20,000 kids coming into our schools over the next 2 years, we're told. We need to make sure they're coming to school ready to learn. We need to make sure that we give them the full skills and opportunities, every one of them, to be successful, because we know that the future of our state, economic strength, social well-being, depends upon all those children having a chance to achieve the American dream through the rest of their lives. I've got a proven commitment to education. I come out of an education background. I know what the challenge is in the real world of that school every day. I know, having been in a couple hundred schools throughout Minnesota, what the real needs are. I mean, this is not about theory. This is not about slogans. This is about effective strategies that build on what we have, which is a good educational system, far better sometimes than the resources we've provided it to be, that we need to empower to be even more successful and give our kids the world-class education they need.
Representative Emmer.
You know, politicians have been making promises for, well, my whole life, probably a lot longer. Promises that we're going to give this to every constituency that's out there in order to get elected. I believe in my colleagues' commitment to education, no question. I've been around them now. We've done a few debates, actually. And I do believe in their commitment to education, but here's the problem. At some point, you can't just keep saying, because we need to spend it, we want to spend it, we're going to spend it. At some point, you got to realize that you can make all the investments in the world, and if you don't have jobs for these people when they get out, if you don't have a growing economy, you're going to lose in the end anyway. This is about recognizing that we do have limited resources, that it is the wrong time to be talking about raising more taxes no matter where they come from. They will directly hit the middle class, and frankly, they'll hit a lot of the folks that are struggling to get by just with the basic needs of life. This is the wrong time in this state and in this country to talk about raising any taxes on people who are just struggling to put food on the table, clothes on their kids, and pay the mortgage. You got to live within your means. We've got to empower our professional administrators and educators to start to put the resources that we have, and let's face it, we've got almost $14 billion. We need to empower the educators, the professionals, to start putting those resources where they can be most effective.
All right.
And we look forward, hopefully, to having that opportunity.
Thank you. Tom Horner.
And I would turn that around a little bit and say that if we don't have the talented, skilled people to fill the jobs in Minnesota, we're not going to have the businesses in Minnesota, because that always will be our distinctive advantage. And we need to make sure that we do have an educated workforce, that we have an educated population to continue the civic vitality of Minnesota. Education is an issue like so many other policy issues in Minnesota. We don't suffer from a lack of great ideas, of innovation, of smart people. We know what to do. This is another issue where it's leadership and political will, where it's somebody who's willing to say, we do have to make tough decisions. And it's not a tough decision just to say, we'll take the status quo and make it a lot bigger, or we'll take the status quo and make it a lot smaller. We need to acknowledge that for so many Minnesotans, in so many issues, it's the status quo that isn't working. We need to think differently. We need innovation. We need to really be different about what it is we do. And that's the opportunity of this election, not to continue down the same path, not to continue doing the kinds of things that we've been doing in the past, but to really be bold, to grab onto that future. And so here's my challenge to you, is that if you want bold leadership in January of 2011, it only happens with bold leadership from voters in November of 2010.
Thank you. Tom Horner, Tom Emmer, Mark Dayton. Good discussion, gentlemen. You can rewatch this debate, study it, take notes. We appreciate you being here. Thank you for watching.